Let's try Jelmer in Netherlands, who pronouns are he, him, and wants to discuss the existence of God and binary logic. So welcome, Jelmer.
Hello, how you doing?
Hi, Matt. Hi, everyday atheist. I'm doing fine, thank you. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thanks.
Doing all right.
Yeah. Yes, my question is, how did you determine that when talking about the existence of a God, that it's only binary classical logic that applies? And how did you rule out, for instance, intuitionistic logic or paraconsistent logic? Where paraconsistent logic allows for contradictions, and intuitionistic logic, and that's a really hard word for me to pronounce, but I'll just keep trying, where intuitionistic logic simply rejects the law of excluded middle.
Oh, okay. Well, that was going to be my initial response, which is when we're talking about the existence of something, right? It's a either it does or it doesn't, right? So abiding by the classical laws of logic.
Well, I think that's semantics. When we're talking about the existence of a God, it's semantics, and I can show that in 4 simple steps.
Hang on.
Well,
hang on.
Can
so first of all, semantics is important. Semantics is important because semantics is about what words mean or how they're being used. And so all I'm going to say is that if I accept identity, non-contradiction, excluded middle, and if you don't accept that, then we're not going to be able to talk about this in the same way. Because when I say that everything is either A or not A, if you come in and say, well, that's not the case, then you're talking about a logic that I don't accept.
So you're completely ruling out intuitionistic logic, then?
I have no reason to rule it in when we're talking about the existence of X, that X either exists or it does not. No other possibility other than X either exists or it does not makes any sense to me.
Right, but I think that I can reword the dichotomy in such a way that we get rid of the word existence and still remain the meaning of the dichotomy, that it's either true that God exists or it's not true that God exists. And I can show it in 4 little simple steps that I think you will agree with every step.
Hang on. You just said you were going to do this where you get rid of the word existence, but the word existence is the thing in question. And then you said you would still reach the conclusion that either God exists or God does not exist. So why on earth would you go through all this work to get to the thing that I already accept?
I can reword the dichotomy and get rid of the word existence while maintain the meaning.
That's not what I asked you. If your conclusion at the end of all this, is still either God exists or God doesn't exist, what's the point in going through it if Justin and I already accept that either God doesn't?
No, at the end, the conclusion is we're talking about properties of reality. That's why I think it's a semantics thing.
It's not, okay. I'll give you your minute.
Go through the 4 steps and I'll explain to you.
I just said I'll give you your minute. But I'm bored before you start, so go ahead.
Okay, so you were talking about true or not true. You're talking about truth, and for that to be meaningful, you have to have a definition for truth. And the definition that you use is truth is that what corresponds to reality. Well, for that to be meaningful, you have to have a definition for reality. And the most common definition for reality that I think you use is that reality is everything there is. And if tomorrow all life in the universe dies, there is still some reality left in the form of dead planets and stars, for instance. So that's the first step. Well, the second step would be, if there is some foundation to reality, then that foundation itself is also reality, because it falls into the definition that I just gave. And the third step would be, if something like a God is foundational to reality, then that God would also be reality, because it falls into the previous 2 steps. So now I can reword your dichotomy and say, well, it's either true that foundational reality has divine properties, or it's not true that foundational reality has divine properties. And with divine properties, I simply mean all-knowing, all-loving, all-powerful. So now I've reworded your dichotomy without the word existence, and the question now becomes,
No,
How
you
do you
haven't.
determine that it's classical binary logic that
No, you
applies to
haven't.
foundational reality?
No, you haven't.
Sure I have.
And you just used classical binary logic right there at the end, because you said the ultimate thing is
Yes,
that you get to.
I did.
Would you stop interrupting me?
I agree with you.
Would
So
you
you don't
shut
need to
up?
proceed.
Okay, I tell you what, I'm going to mute you, and I'll unmute you when I'm done talking, because what you said was, my definition of reality is that, or truth is that which corresponds to reality, and reality is everything there is. And I'm fine with those. And I don't for a second proclaim capital T truth or any of that. But then you say, if there is a foundation to reality, I don't even know what that means. What does it mean that there's a foundation to reality? So that's your first if, which you haven't demonstrated that there is a foundation to reality. Then your second if is if something like a God is foundational to reality. So you start with reality, and then you say, if there is a God or something like a God, which is foundational to reality, and none of that makes any sense. None of it's been demonstrated at all. But you then get to either it's true that foundational reality has defined properties, or it's not true that foundational reality has defined properties. But that conclusion is either true or not true, which accepts the bivalent logic that I was already talking about. It talks about identity, non-contradiction, excluded middle. So all of your work to remove the word exist is irrelevant, because your case here hasn't demonstrated anything. It didn't demonstrate that there is a foundation to reality. It didn't demonstrate that there's something like a God that serves as a foundation to reality. And so you went through all that work just to get to either it is either true or not true that foundational reality has defined properties. And if you would have started the call by saying it's either true or not true that foundational reality has defined properties, I would have just agreed with you at the start, and we wouldn't have wasted any time on your pedantic little concerns about semantics surrounding the word exist. Now, where did I go wrong?
Well, where you go wrong is that it seems that you're saying that I have made any kind of claim, or that I want to establish something. I started out with a simple question: how did you determine that it's classical binary logic that applies to foundational reality? And how did you rule out that it's intuitionistic logic that...
Stop and listen. I asked you where I went wrong, and your response to that was, I went wrong by assuming that you had a point. Is that really what you're saying? That my error was in assuming that you were making a claim?
Yes.
Then goodbye, sir. I don't want to waste any more time with you, because I want to know what people believe.
Isn't it? Now that's easy.
I want to know.
That is easy.
I want to know
now
what
you're a coward. Because
I'm not a coward. I'm muting you. I'm not hanging up yet, because I'm pointing out your dishonesty in this conversation. The purpose of this show is for you to tell us what you believe and why. And when you say that I've made a mistake in assuming that you had a claim, that's not a mistake that I made. That's a genuine, reasonable assumption, because that's what the purpose of the fucking show is. But when you call in to say, how did I determine it was bivalent logic? And then you went down to bivalent logic at the end of it, only to avoid words, you are wasting everybody's time. When did you demonstrate that the reality has a foundation and that it is godlike?
You didn't ask. I started out with a question, and you didn't at any point ask me what I believe and why. So now you're blaming me that I didn't tell you what I believe and why. You didn't ask me.
You presented an argument.
And I
presented an argument that ultimately agreed with me. What's your fucking point?
No, I asked you, how did you determine that's classical binary logic as applies to foundational reality?
Did I ever answer that question?
No, I'm still waiting for an answer.
Because I didn't determine that.
How did you determine that it's classical
are you going to try and talk over me at every point? I swear. All right, goodbye, jackass. Now, the question that you asked is, how did I determine that it's based on this logic and not another? I didn't determine that. I accept identity, non-contradiction, excluded middle as necessary preconceptions, as necessary premises. Or no, wow. As necessary assumptions. And then you presented a case that ultimately got down to accepting those same assumptions. Because if you just said, as I pointed out, your conclusion that it's either true that foundational reality has defined properties, or it is not true that foundational reality has defined properties, if you would have said that as your opening line, I would have said, I completely agree, which means everything else is you tap dancing around bullshit and not actually making any claim. You agreed with me. That's the way it goes. And if you're going to say that my mistake was in assuming that you had a point, well, congratulations. We won't have to have you back on since you don't want to make a point.